She arrived on screen like a sudden spark, a soft glow that lit up the silent era long before Hollywood learned how to speak. Olive Thomas, born in 1894, became the face audiences reached for when they wanted escape. Her smile carried the promise of mischief, the kind that felt innocent until it wasn't. In a world of dim theaters and shimmering projections, she was the bright figure dancing just beyond the reach of ordinary life. Magazines called her the most beautiful girl in the world. Cameramen described her as someone celluloid adored. Every frame seemed to cradle her gently, as if the medium itself understood it had found someone special. Crowds lined up to watch her laugh, pout, and flick her wrists in that playful way that made her seem both daring and untouched by the darker things of the world. But fame in early Hollywood was thin ice over deep water. Behind the applause lay a system that polished its stars while hiding every crack behind their glow. And for Olive, that glow dimmed faster than anyone expected. In September 1920, she traveled to Paris, far from the studios that had built her legend. Just days later, the news arrived. She was dead. The world mourned the tragedy. Newspapers wrote about an accident, a bottle of mercury bichloride, a frantic race to save her life. The public saw the surface.
The studio saw something else. In the weeks that followed, quiet hands moved through vaults and filing rooms. A film she had recently worked on, a project not yet released, was suddenly withdrawn. Production logs ended mid-line. Advance posters disappeared from theater shipments. Somewhere between her final breath and the studio's official press statement, an entire reel of Olive Thomas vanished from circulation. It was never screened, never archived, never spoken of again. A smile once celebrated by millions now had a missing frame, a fragment of film erased from history with the same silence that swallowed so many early Hollywood stories. And as with all things removed too quickly, questions linger in the shadows she left behind.
Before her name drifted across marquees, before the cameras learned the shape of her face, Olive Thomas belonged to places where dreams were smaller, quieter, and often left behind. She was born Oliva R. Duffy in Charleroi, Pennsylvania, a mill town carved from soot and river water. The air trembled with the heavy pulse of ironworks, and the nights stretched long over narrow streets where children grew fast because life told them to. Her childhood was marked by motion. Factories rose and fell, jobs vanished overnight. Her family moved in search of something steadier, but stability never stayed long. When Olive was still young, her mother remarried after a painful separation, and the new household tried to stitch itself together. The world around her was uncertain, but she developed early a resilience that would later hold her through the bright, brutal tempo of show business. It was not glamour she grew from, but grit. She worked small jobs to help her family. Seamstress's helper, salesgirl, errands for neighbors who barely had the spare coins to offer in return. In quieter moments, she drew flowers, women in gowns she had only imagined, a face she did not know, a place where life felt softer. Art became the only room where she could breathe without worry, the one talent that hinted she might belong to a world beyond the mills. One afternoon, when she was still only teenager, she entered a local beauty contest, not because she expected to win, but because the idea of being seen, truly seen, felt like a momentary escape from the noise of day-to-day survival. She didn't just win, she stunned. The newspapers called her a young woman of remarkable presence, and for the first time, the glow that would one day fill theaters flickered faintly into being. By 19, she left Pennsylvania for New York. She boarded the train alone. No spotlight, no guarantees, just a suitcase and the fragile faith that something waited for her beyond the endless gray of factory roofs. New York did not welcome newcomers kindly, but Olive carried a kind of stillness inside her, the quiet assurance of someone who had seen enough hardship to know she could endure more.
She took modest work, retail, clerking, sewing, until the day she stepped into the studio of the celebrated illustrator Howard Chandler Christie. Her beauty had a softness that resisted artifice, and Christie saw immediately what the world would later discover. He chose her as a model. She became a Christie girl, the emblem of youthful romance in countless illustrations and covers. It was her first brush with the pulsing light that grows behind a person the moment the world starts to watch. Yet beneath the early applause lay the echo of her childhood, a familiarity with struggle that taught her how quickly fortune could turn. Photographers described her as warm but guarded. Friends remembered her as kind but private. And in every image from that era, there is a trace of distance in her eyes, as if a part of her remained anchored to the quiet streets of her past, unwilling to surrender entirely to the fickle glow of fame. This early life shaped her. It gave her the toughness to survive New York, the determination to push beyond the expected, and the vulnerability that made her performances feel unpolished in the best way, human, fragile, and deeply sincere. The cameras responded to her authenticity because it could not be faked. It came from years of learning that the world was both beautiful and unforgiving, and that a single opportunity could either open a door or close it forever. Olive Thomas did not emerge from a life of privilege. She rose from a childhood threaded with hardship, perseverance, and silence. And perhaps that is why her later disappearance from the archives, the missing reel, the sudden erasure, feels so haunting. She had fought too hard to be seen. She had earned every moment of her light. Yet somewhere in the vaults of early Hollywood, a piece of her story slipped back into darkness, as if the shadows of her past had followed her farther than anyone realized.
When Olive Thomas stepped into the moving picture world, it was as though a long-closed door finally yielded to her persistence. Her start was modest, brief appearances, small roles shaped more by circumstance than intention. Yet in each frame, she carried the same quality that had elevated her from a mill town to the heart of New York's art scene, a luminosity that drew the camera toward her, unforced and unmistakable. By 1915, she entered the orbit of legendary producer Florenz Ziegfeld, first as a member of his Follies, then as one of his most photographed performers. She learned the rhythm of public adoration. The stage taught her timing. The photographers taught her poise, but it was film that taught her scale, the ability to let emotion travel through a lens and into countless unseen viewers. Her transition to cinema arrived naturally, as if the medium had been waiting for her. Silent films demanded clarity without sound, truth without words. Olive possessed an expressive softness that made her a natural in close-ups. Directors noted her instinctive awareness of the camera's presence, the way she could shift a scene's entire tone with a slight narrowing of her eyes or a quiet tilt of her head. Audiences responded with enthusiasm, and her fan base grew rapidly. As the industry expanded, so did her ambition. She signed with the Selznick Pictures Corporation, one of the era's most influential forces. Under their banner, she starred in a series of light comedies, dramas, and romance pictures. Films like Youthful Folly and The Flapper, the latter would cement her image as the face of a modern, carefree femininity. Olive embodied the early archetype of the flapper, bold, playful, mischievous. She did not merely portray the spirit of the 1920s, she helped define it. But beneath the shimmer of success, a quiet tension began to form, invisible to the crowds who saw only the polished surface. Hollywood in the 1910s and early 1920s was a machine of relentless motion. Stars were made quickly, pushed forward constantly, and replaced without ceremony. Every rising light existed under the weight of expectation.
For Olive, the pressure came not only from public demand, but from the studio's growing investment in her image. As she matured as an actress, she started taking on more complex roles, characters with shadows rather than sparkle. She started work on an unreleased project, a film that studio records now mention only sparingly. It was intended to show a different side of her, one more dramatic than her previous work, and early reports from set suggested she delivered performances that surprised even seasoned directors. The footage was completed, but never screened publicly. Production logs list it simply as pending review. This project signaled a turning point. Olive was shifting from charming ingenue towards serious actress, carving out a path that promised longevity beyond the ephemeral fame of the flapper era. Industry insiders spoke of her as someone on the verge of transcending typecasting. Critics anticipated a breakout transformation. Yet, as her career ascended, the cracks beneath the glitter widened. Public fascination with her personal life intensified. Her marriage to Jack Pickford, brother of Mary Pickford, the most famous woman in the world at the time, placed her under a magnifying glass. Gossip columns hovered around the couple, feeding on whispers of volatility and excess. Some of the stories were exaggerated. Others were rooted in the darker edges of Hollywood nightlife. Olive smiled through it all, but the strain showed in small, fleeting ways. Still, she worked, she filmed, she pushed forward. The unreleased project, its reels stored in a vault, its posters set aside for later distribution, was meant to mark her next chapter, a demonstration of her full range. In Selznick's ledgers, it appears in neat, confident handwriting. A film allocated its budget, its cast, its scheduled release window. Then, life changed its script. She left for Paris, hoping for rest, a reprieve, a reset before the next wave of publicity. She carried with her the weight of an industry that did not pause, even when its brightest faces faltered. The project remained behind in a Los Angeles vault, waiting silently for her return. It never came. And in the days immediately following the tragedy, the momentum of her career, so alive, so ascending, stopped abruptly. Production records that once tracked her progress ended in blank spaces. Promotion materials scheduled for circulation were pulled back. The unreleased film, the work that was meant to reshape her artistic identity, slipped into a silence deeper than any the industry had intended. By the end of 1920, Olive Thomas was remembered for her radiance, her charm, and the films the public adored. But the final work she created, the footage that held the promise of an actress evolving into something greater, vanished from history, leaving behind only a question the screen could no longer answer.
Paris, September 1920. The city was warm, restless, and alive with its usual midnight pulse. But inside the Hotel Ritz, behind closed doors far from the glow of any camera, a different kind of silence was forming. A silence that would swallow one of Hollywood's brightest lights. Olive Thomas had traveled to France seeking something simple: distance. She needed rest after years of relentless schedules, after a marriage strained beneath the pressure of fame, after nights that lasted longer than they should have. She had wrapped her latest project, the unreleased film now waiting in a studio vault in Los Angeles, and she planned to return home, renewed. But Hollywood rarely let go so easily, and neither did fate. In the early hours of September 5, a desperate cry echoed down the hallway of the Ritz. Jack Pickford, frantic and half-dressed, shouted for help. Olive had mistakenly ingested a toxic solution of mercury bichloride, an antiseptic commonly used at the time. The official report stated it was an accident. She thought it was her sleeping powder. The bottle labels, similar in shape and size, sat too close together. No witnesses could offer more than fragments of sound and urgency. The Paris doctors fought to save her. For 5 days they tried. Newspapers across continents printed updates in bold type, their headlines trembling between hope and panic. Crowds gathered outside studios back in America, praying the beloved star would recover. But in the quiet hours before dawn on September 10, Olive Thomas slipped away. The cameras that once adored her were thousands of miles away. The applause that had lifted her career into stardust now felt impossibly distant. Hollywood reacted with shock, then with swiftness. The studios issued measured statements, carefully worded lines designed to steady public sentiment. They spoke of sorrow, tragedy, loss. Yet beneath the quiet grief, something else moved. A controlled urgency, an immediate redirection of attention, a practiced form of silence known only to those who understood how fragile a star's image could be.
Within 24 hours, production logs began to shift. Pages concerning her upcoming publicity cycle were revised or removed. Prearranged theater shipments of promotional materials were recalled. Posters that included Olive's face, intended for the release of her completed but unreleased film, were quietly pulled before they reached the lobbies they were designed to fill. Official memos from studio headquarters avoided any mention of the pending project. Instead, they focused on preserving the sanctity of Olive's legacy, insisting on respectful remembrance. But respect and control often shared a thin border in early Hollywood. Behind polite words, decisions were being made with an urgency that suggested more than mourning. Someone had determined what would remain and what would not. In France, the investigation concluded cleanly. No foul play, no scandal, only tragedy. Yet rumors began to drift, even as telegram ink dried. Some whispered of tension in her marriage. Others speculated about the nights in Paris before the incident. The public wanted answers. The studios wanted closure. What was certain is that Olive's final moments remained framed by uncertainty. What exactly happened in that hotel room? What was said? Who was present in the last minutes before the accident? The records stop where clarity should begin, leaving only unanswered questions suspended between sorrow and speculation. And somewhere between Paris and Los Angeles, as grief spread across 2 continents, the fate of her last film, the reel she had poured her final work into, was sealed. The tragedy that ended her life cast a long shadow over the project that was meant to begin her next chapter. Instead of premiering, it disappeared. Instead of being celebrated, it was withdrawn. Hollywood mourned Olive Thomas, but the silence that followed her death carried a second loss, one the public never knew to grieve.
In the weeks after Olive Thomas's death, a soft, deliberate quiet began to form around her final work. It did not arrive with announcements or press statements. It moved in shadows, through filing rooms, through vault inventories, through the careful hands of employees who had been instructed to handle certain documents with sensitivity. But sensitivity in early Hollywood was often another word for disappearance. The unreleased film Olive had just completed lingered in the production logs under a simple description: status pending. Nothing unusual at first glance. Many films spent time in that limbo between editing and distribution. But what happened next deviated from the pattern. During September and October 1920, lines in the studio ledger began to change. Ink grew darker over earlier entries. Notes were shortened, rewritten, or quietly removed. Most subtle was the shift from language of anticipation to language of restraint. Where the film had once been marked for early release, the words were replaced with a colder phrase: hold order. Beneath it, another note appeared, faint and nearly lost in the margins: review suspended. Then came the withdrawal. Records show that posters for the unreleased project had already been printed. Some had been shipped. All were recalled.
Shipping logs list several return orders, each stamp with the same directive: remove from circulation. When the posters resurfaced in storage inventories years later, many bore signs of damage, as if they had been handled hurriedly. Some sets were missing entirely. Studio archivists of the time kept meticulous lists of film elements, camera negatives, positive prints, edited reels. Each title possessed a clear paper trail. Olive's final project, however, splintered. Early inventories show the existence of multiple reels. Later inventories list only fragments. One reel appears consistently in the earliest logs, then vanishes from every subsequent record. The studio offered no explanation. The missing reel is the heart of the mystery. In the official internal documents, it is referred to only by its production number. No scene descriptions, no casting notes, no editorial remarks. All the written material that should accompany a completed reel is absent. The only surviving trace is a single archival notation dated weeks after Olive's death. It reads, "Returned from exchange, not to be released." Returned from where? And why? Film historians who reviewed these records decades later noted something unusual. There is no standard reason code, no notation of damage, no equipment failure, no censorship request, nothing to justify its removal. The reel simply appears once, then vanishes into the folds of history, leaving behind only the ghost of its existence.
Some speculate the footage contained scenes that felt too intimate, too raw in the wake of her death. Others suggest the studio feared public scrutiny, worried that releasing a new film so soon might seem exploitative. But these are theories, not evidence. The only concrete truth is that the reel was withdrawn with a level of urgency that suggests internal decision, not accident. Equally striking is how quickly conversations around Olive's unreleased project dissolved from the industry press. Before her death, the studio had plans for promotion. Afterward, not a single article mentioned it. Trade publications that regularly tracked upcoming releases omitted the title without correction or explanation. In a business where delays and cancellations were common and openly discussed, the silence around this film is remarkable. There are other threads, subtle but persistent. A studio memo referencing protecting her legacy. A theater manager's note asking why a scheduled shipment never arrived. An editor's log that lists a reel number with a line drawn through it so heavy that the paper buckles. A box in a later archive labeled unassigned, believed to have once belonged to the project but containing nothing inside. As decades passed, attempts to locate the footage yielded nothing. Archivists traced shipments, reviewed storage transfers, and combed through vault records. Not a single confirmed print, negative, or fragment of the reel has ever surfaced. What remains of the film is limited to paper, a few production stills, an incomplete title list, and a series of ledgers that end in blank space. In the history of early cinema, many reels have been lost to decay, fire, or neglect. But Olive Thomas's missing footage is different. It did not fade with time. It did not dissolve from nitrate decomposition. It disappeared at the exact moment the studio moved to control the narrative surrounding her death. The tragedy in Paris claimed all of life. The silence that followed claimed her final performance. Somewhere between the vault and the ledger, a decision was made. Whether out of grief, caution, or something deeper, someone ensured the public would never see the last moments she created for the screen. And in doing so, they erased what might have been the most telling piece of her legacy, a woman stepping into a new chapter,
captured on film and then removed from history's view. In the dim rooms of early Hollywood, where light and shadow shaped the dreams of millions, Olive Thomas was once a promise the world believed in. Her rise had been swift, her presence unmistakable. She entered the frame with a confidence born not from privilege, but from a childhood that taught her how fragile and valuable visibility could be. She knew how to hold the gaze of a restless audience, and for a brief moment in cinema's infancy, she became one of its brightest reflections. But history is not built only from what survives. It is shaped just as powerfully by what disappears. After her death in Paris, the world mourned the loss of a star whose screen had barely begun to widen. Yet another loss, quieter and deeper, unfolded in the vaults of the studio she had worked so hard to rise within. The final reel she completed, the last performance she offered the camera, slipped from the public record without explanation. It did not decay. It did not burn. It was taken back into silence. Today, her films that remain still shimmer with the charm and vitality audiences loved. They show the Olive the world remembers, playful, luminous, alive with the energy of a new era. But the missing footage, the work meant to mark her next evolution, exists only as an absence, a shadow without a figure, a whisper behind the curtain. Perhaps that is why her story lingers, not only because she left too soon, not only because her death carried questions that time never fully settled, but because a part of her artistry was taken before anyone could see it. In the gap where her final reel should be, the viewer is left with an echo, faint but insistent, asking what she might have become had her life and career continued on the path she was carving. In Hollywood, the lights shine brightest on those the public adores, but in its archives, behind locked doors and lost inventory lists, lie the stories that define its most haunting truths. Olive Thomas remains one of them, a star preserved in fragments, remembered in glowing frames, yet missing the piece that might have shown her most vulnerable, most powerful transformation. The applause that once greeted her has long faded, but the silence left by the vanished film endures, a reminder that even the brightest images can be dimmed, and even the most celebrated stars can leave behind mysteries the screen will never resolve. In Hollywood, every smile has an echo, and sometimes the echo is all we have left.